The December storm of 1882 lashed the White River with a fury that spoke of ancient wrath, as 62-year-old Elijah Harlan pushed his weathered skiff through waters that churned like liquid obsidian beneath lightning that split the Arkansas sky with supernatural intensity. The gaunt patriarch had been fishing these treacherous currents for 4 decades. But tonight's compulsion differed from normal hunger for bass and catfish. Something deeper than conscious will drove him onto the storm-swept river, despite his granddaughter Abigail's desperate pleas to remain safe in their cabin that perched precariously on limestone bluffs overlooking Devil's Eddy. The Harlan family had prospered where other Ozark settlers had failed, their nets always full, while neighbors struggled through lean seasons that broke lesser men and drove families from the harsh mountain wilderness back to easier lives in settled territories. Elijah's success as a fisherman had enabled him to purchase substantial riverside property, build a sturdy homestead, and provide well for his extended family throughout decades when economic hardship claimed most Arkansas mountain communities. But the source of their unusual fortune remained shrouded in family secrets that grew more troubling with each passing generation. The storm's intensity increased as Elijah guided his skiff toward the deepest channel where Devil's Eddy created treacherous currents that had claimed dozens of lives throughout the settlement period. But tonight, the water seemed to call his name with voices that penetrated the thunder and driving rain. His weathered hands, marked by strange scales that had appeared along his neck and wrists during recent months, gripped the oars with supernatural strength as he fought against currents that should have overwhelmed any mortal man attempting to navigate the flooded river during such violent weather conditions. Lightning illuminated the churning waters with stroboscopic fury, revealing glimpses of movement beneath the surface that exceeded anything natural to Arkansas waterways, massive shapes that moved with purpose and intelligence through the storm-darkened depths. Elijah's experienced eye recognized that these were not the sturgeon or alligator gar that occasionally inhabited the White River system, but something fundamentally different that seemed to pulse with the same malevolent energy that had been calling him from his warm cabin into this supernatural tempest. The first manifestation rose from Devil's Eddy with the slow majesty of nightmare-made flesh, as water cascaded from a form that retained human proportions while displaying adaptations that belonged to no earthly creature. The being that emerged from the depths wore Magnus Harlan's face, but transformed beyond recognition by scales that gleamed like ancient armor, a bony protrusion that crowned his skull like some primordial horn, and eyes that burned with phosphorescent hunger that pierced the storm's darkness with predatory intelligence. Elijah's brother Magnus had disappeared 3 months ago during a routine fishing expedition, his empty boat discovered drifting near the abandoned mill that had served the Harlan family's mysterious purposes for generations. The family had mourned his presumed drowning, while privately suspecting that his fate connected to the strange compulsions and physical changes that had been affecting family members with increasing frequency. But none had imagined the true horror of his transformation into this aquatic abomination that now regarded Elijah with eyes that retained terrible human awareness. The creature that had been Magnus spoke through guttural sounds that bypassed normal hearing to resonate directly within Elijah's consciousness, communicating concepts that human language could not adequately express, but that Elijah somehow understood with crystalline clarity. The family debt required payment in blood, the ancient pact demanded renewal through sacrifice, and the time had come for Elijah to acknowledge his role in perpetuating agreements that predated his own birth, but bound him through inherited obligation that could not be escaped through ignorance or denial. The scales that had been appearing along Elijah's neck began to multiply and spread across his shoulders and arms, as proximity to his transformed brother triggered dormant genetic modifications that had been waiting for activation throughout his adult life. The physical changes, accompanied psychological shifts that enabled him to perceive the underwater realm where his family's true masters dwelt. Ancient entities whose patience with human reluctance was reaching its predetermined limits, as the winter storms of 1882 created optimal conditions for enforcing supernatural contracts through methods that exceeded mortal comprehension. Magnus gestured toward the depths with movements that retained human intelligence while displaying aquatic adaptations that enabled perfect underwater navigation, indicating hidden caverns where the family's true history lay preserved in symbols carved by ancestors whose transformation had enabled them to survive as guardians of secrets that ordinary humanity could not comprehend. The communication included images of ritualistic drownings, systematic sacrifice of travelers and locals whose deaths had maintained the Harlan family's prosperity while feeding entities whose hunger for human life sustained their protection of chosen bloodlines. The storm reached its crescendo as Elijah felt his human identity dissolving into something larger and more terrible, his consciousness expanding to encompass awareness of every creature that swam in the White River system, while simultaneously understanding his family's role as intermediaries between human and aquatic realms. The transformation was not sudden mutation, but gradual revelation of characteristics that had always been present, waiting for the proper triggering conditions to manifest the true nature that separated the Harlan bloodline from ordinary humanity. Lightning revealed other shapes moving through the turbulent waters as additional family members emerged from depths where they had been waiting for this moment of recognition and acceptance. Their aquatic forms, displaying variations of the same fundamental modifications that enabled underwater existence, while retaining enough human intelligence to serve as bridges between species. The revelation that multiple relatives had undergone transformation created understanding that the Harlan family curse affected entire generations rather than isolated individuals, creating an underwater community of hybrid beings whose existence depended upon maintaining ancient bargains through regular sacrifice. The psychological impact of witnessing his family's true nature overwhelmed Elijah's remaining human sensibilities as he realized that their mountain prosperity had always been purchased through systematic murder disguised as accidental drownings, mysterious disappearances, and occasional monsters that local folklore attributed to natural phenomena rather than deliberate predation by creatures who retained enough humanity to understand their victims' terror while possessing sufficient aquatic adaptation to hunt with supernatural efficiency. The storm began to subside as Elijah accepted his hereditary obligations and allowed the transformation to proceed, his human form adapting to requirements of amphibious existence, while his consciousness expanded to encompass communication with entities whose existence predated human settlement of the Arkansas wilderness. The bargain that his ancestors had made during desperate times now claimed another generation, binding him to roles and responsibilities that would define the remainder of his existence as guardian of secrets that must never be revealed to ordinary humanity. The return journey to shore marked Elijah's final transition from human to something fundamentally different, as his enhanced senses detected every living creature within miles of the river system, while his modified consciousness processed information about weather patterns, water levels, and optimal conditions for conducting the family's hereditary responsibilities. The scales that now covered significant portions of his body provided protection and enhanced swimming capability, while marking him as fundamentally separate from the human community he would continue to appear to serve. As dawn approached and the storm's fury dissipated, Elijah secured his skiff and walked toward the family homestead with steps that left wet tracks despite the passage of hours since leaving the water. His transformed physiology requiring regular immersion while enabling him to function on land for extended periods when family duties demanded human interaction. The burden of knowledge that now weighted his consciousness included awareness that other family members must soon undergo similar revelations, as the ancient pact required sufficient guardians to maintain protection and prosperity through changing times. The sight of his granddaughter Abigail waiting anxiously on the cabin porch created profound emotional conflict, as Elijah realized that her inherited sensitivity to spiritual forces made her both essential to the family's supernatural obligations and potentially capable of choosing a different path that might break generations of blood-soaked tradition. The decision about her ultimate fate would define not only her future, but the continuation or termination of agreements that had sustained the Harlan lineage through decades of mountain hardship that had destroyed most other families. The harsh January of 1883 brought unprecedented cold that froze the White River's surface in sheets thick enough to support human weight, but beneath the ice, currents continued flowing through limestone channels that connected to underground systems where transformed members of the Harlan family maintained their vigil over ancient obligations that demanded regular fulfillment regardless of weather conditions that might discourage normal human activity along the treacherous waterways. Rebecca Harlan had noticed disturbing changes in her family members following Elijah's December storm experience, as her children began disappearing during full moon periods, only to return days later with no memory of their absence, but bearing subtle physical modifications that suggested exposure to conditions that exceeded normal Arkansas mountain environments. The discovery of webbed skin between her youngest son's fingers created maternal alarm that intensified when she observed similar adaptations developing in her other children, alongside behavioral changes that included craving for raw fish and compulsive attraction to water sources. Dr. Ezra Whitfield, the region's only physician whose medical practice served scattered mountain communities throughout the Ozark wilderness, had been documenting unusual physiological conditions affecting the Harlan family for decades, while maintaining careful records that revealed patterns of inherited modifications that exceeded normal genetic variation. His secret files contained detailed observations of scale development, respiratory adaptations, and psychological changes that accompanied what appeared to be systematic transformation of human physiology according to predetermined biological programming. The discovery of torn clothing beside the frozen river's edge during a February thaw created evidence that Rebecca's fears about her family's condition were justified, as blood-stained fabric and strange tracks in the mud suggested violent encounters that exceeded normal accidents or wild animal attacks. The tracks displayed characteristics that combined human foot structure with aquatic adaptations, including webbed toes and claw marks that penetrated frozen ground with supernatural force, while following patterns that indicated intelligent rather than instinctual behavior. Rebecca's confrontation with Dr. Whitfield regarding her family's condition revealed the physician's extensive knowledge of what he termed the Harlan curse, a hereditary condition that affected multiple generations through what appeared to be systematic genetic modification, enabling amphibious existence while maintaining sufficient human characteristics to function within normal society. His documentation included detailed medical observations, family genealogies, and historical accounts that traced the condition's origins to agreements made during the earliest period of Arkansas settlement, when desperate circumstances had driven her husband's ancestors to seek supernatural assistance. The medical records that Dr. Whitfield maintained in his private collection revealed that every generation of Harlans had produced at least one fully transformed individual who served as primary enforcer of ancient agreements, while other family members experienced varying degrees of modification that enabled them to function as intermediaries between human and aquatic realms. The systematic nature of these transformations suggested deliberate biological programming rather than random mutation, indicating that the family's supernatural bargain included specific physiological requirements for maintaining effectiveness across multiple generations. The revelation that her husband's family prosperity had been purchased through systematic sacrifice of travelers and local residents created psychological trauma that challenged Rebecca's fundamental understanding of morality and family loyalty, as she realized that their comfortable lifestyle depended upon regular murder, disguised as accidental drownings and mysterious disappearances that had characterized White River folklore for decades. The knowledge that her own children carried genetic programming that would eventually compel them to participate in systematic killing created desperation that drove her to seek methods for protecting them from their inherited obligations. The winter's most severe storm brought conditions that triggered mass transformation among family members, as multiple individuals simultaneously underwent modifications that prepared them for underwater existence during the season, when ice coverage provided optimal concealment for aquatic activities that required complete submersion for extended periods. Rebecca witnessed her youngest son's emergence from the frozen river as a scaled horror, whose retention of human intelligence made his transformation more terrifying than simple mutation, as his deliberate approach and attempted communication revealed that the family curse preserved consciousness while fundamentally altering moral frameworks and survival priorities. The systematic nature of the transformations became apparent as Rebecca observed coordination between modified family members whose underwater activities appeared to follow predetermined patterns rather than random predatory behavior, suggesting that their aquatic adaptations enabled them to serve specific functions within a larger supernatural system that required regular maintenance through human sacrifice and territorial protection. The organization and intelligence displayed by the transformed family members indicated that the curse provided not only physical modifications, but also knowledge and behavioral programming necessary for effective service to ancient entities. The psychological horror of witnessing her children's transformation exceeded physical fear as Rebecca realized that the aquatic modifications preserved their personalities and memories while systematically eliminating human empathy and moral restraints that might interfere with their hereditary obligations to conduct ritualistic drownings and harvest human life force for entities whose continued protection required regular feeding. The retention of human consciousness within monstrous forms created tragedy that exceeded simple loss through death, as her children remained recognizably themselves while becoming fundamentally incompatible with human moral frameworks. The discovery of underwater caves accessible through hidden entrances beneath the family homestead revealed the full scope of the Harlan curse's infrastructure, as limestone caverns had been modified to accommodate amphibious existence, while serving as storage areas for ritual implements and preserved remains of sacrificial victims whose systematic elimination had sustained the family's supernatural bargain throughout multiple generations. The architectural modifications indicated long-term planning and sophisticated understanding of both human and aquatic environmental requirements. The evidence of systematic victim processing within the hidden caverns included carefully arranged skeletal remains, ritual implements designed for underwater ceremonial use, and carved symbols that recorded details of individual sacrifices while maintaining accounting systems that tracked the family's ongoing obligations to supernatural entities whose protection required specific quantities and types of human life force, harvested according to predetermined schedules and seasonal requirements. The confrontation with her transformed son in the cavern's depths forced Rebecca to acknowledge that traditional maternal protection was inadequate for addressing supernatural threats that operated beyond normal physical and psychological parameters, as the child's aquatic adaptations provided capabilities that exceeded human defensive measures, while his retained intelligence enabled him to exploit her emotional vulnerabilities for purposes that served entities whose continued favor required elimination of potential obstacles to family compliance with ancient agreements. The realization that her husband's extended family included numerous individuals who had undergone similar transformations throughout previous generations created understanding that the Harlan curse affected entire bloodlines rather than isolated individuals, producing communities of hybrid beings whose existence depended upon maintaining supernatural bargains through methods that required systematic deception of ordinary human populations while conducting regular harvest operations disguised as natural phenomena or accidental deaths. The winter's end brought increased activity among transformed family members as seasonal changes created optimal conditions for conducting large-scale harvest operations that would replenish spiritual resources depleted during months of minimal sacrifice, requiring Rebecca to choose between attempting to protect her remaining children through methods that might challenge supernatural entities whose retaliation could destroy not only her family, but potentially the entire regional population that depended upon their continued favor for protection from natural disasters and economic hardship. The final revelation that her own genetic inheritance included dormant modifications that would eventually enable her transformation into an aquatic form created understanding that escape from the family curse was impossible through normal means. As every individual carrying Harlan bloodline contained biological programming that would activate under appropriate conditions, regardless of personal choices or moral objections to participating in systematic murder for supernatural purposes. As winter yielded to spring and flood conditions created optimal circumstances for large-scale aquatic operations, Rebecca faced the horrifying recognition that her maternal obligations required protecting her children from transformation, while simultaneously acknowledging that their genetic inheritance made resistance ultimately futile, unless she could discover methods for breaking supernatural agreements that had bound multiple generations to service of entities whose continued favor required regular payment in human blood and systematic elimination of potential threats to their aquatic territory. The March thaw of 1883 swelled the White River beyond its normal banks, creating flood conditions that awakened dormant spiritual forces throughout the Ozark wilderness, while providing optimal circumstances for ancient entities to manifest with unprecedented power through servants whose aquatic adaptations enabled them to navigate treacherous currents that would overwhelm ordinary humans attempting to traverse the expanded waterways during the season of greatest supernatural activity. 17-year-old Abigail Harlan possessed inherited sensitivity to spiritual phenomena that enabled her to perceive supernatural currents flowing beneath mundane reality, granting awareness that her family's prosperity derived from sources that exceeded normal fishing success, while creating obligations that bound each generation to service of entities whose true nature remained concealed behind carefully maintained facades of natural phenomenon and regional folklore that attributed mysterious drownings to conventional rather than supernatural causation. Samuel Creek Walker, the 73-year-old mixed heritage shaman whose grandmother had been Quapaw and whose grandfather had been among the earliest European settlers to establish permanent communities along the White River system, maintained a remote dwelling where protective wards and accumulated spiritual knowledge enabled him to serve as guardian against supernatural threats that periodically challenged human populations throughout the Arkansas wilderness. His understanding of both Native American spiritual traditions and European occult practices qualified him as one of the few individuals capable of providing effective guidance for addressing supernatural agreements that bound families to service of ancient entities. The journey to Creekwalker's Lodge required Abigail to traverse flooded bottomlands where normal landmarks had been submerged beneath waters that carried more than physical debris from upstream settlements. As spiritual contamination from decades of ritualistic drownings and systematic sacrifice had imbued the floodwaters with malevolent energy that affected both human psychology and environmental conditions. The heightened spiritual activity created optimal circumstances for supernatural manifestation, while simultaneously increasing dangers for individuals whose bloodline connections made them vulnerable to entities seeking to enforce ancient agreements through methods that exceeded mortal comprehension. Creekwalker's recognition of Abigail's unique spiritual sensitivity enabled him to share knowledge that had been preserved through generations of traditional keepers, whose responsibility included maintaining accurate records of supernatural agreements and protective methods that might enable future generations to address spiritual threats that periodically challenged human communities throughout. Regions where ancient entities maintained territorial claims that predated European settlement and continued operating according to spiritual laws that exceeded contemporary legal and religious frameworks. The revelation of the Harlan family's true history required Creekwalker to share sacred knowledge that he had protected throughout his adult life. As the original pact between Abigail's ancestors and river spirits had been witnessed by his own grandmother, whose traditional obligations included recording supernatural agreements and monitoring their effects on both human and natural communities throughout the region. The documentation that Creekwalker maintained included detailed accounts of the initial bargaining process, specific terms of the supernatural contract, and methods that previous generations had attempted for modifying or terminating agreements that bound entire bloodlines to service of entities whose patience with human reluctance was approaching predetermined limits. The historical account that Creekwalker provided revealed that Abigail's ancestors had approached river spirits during the catastrophic drought of 1847, when failing crops and dying livestock had threatened community survival. While normal methods of water conservation and agricultural adaptation had proven inadequate for addressing environmental conditions that exceeded typical seasonal variation. The desperation that drove the original Harlan patriarch to seek supernatural assistance had created circumstances where ancient entities could establish agreements that provided immediate relief while binding future generations to obligations that would ensure continuing spiritual nourishment through human sacrifice and territorial protection. The terms of the supernatural contract, as preserved in Creekwalker's sacred records, specified that river spirits would provide abundant fishing, protection from natural disasters, and prosperity for the Harlan bloodline in exchange for regular sacrifice of human life and service as guardians who would eliminate potential threats to aquatic territory while maintaining secrecy about supernatural presence through methods that attributed mysterious deaths to natural phenomena rather than deliberate predation by entities whose existence challenged conventional understanding of reality. The journey to the Bone Cavern required traversing underwater passages that had been carved by supernatural forces during millennia of spiritual activity, creating chambers where physical and spiritual realms intersected in ways that enabled communication between human and aquatic entities, while providing storage areas for ritual implements and preserved remains of sacrificial victims whose systematic elimination had sustained supernatural agreements throughout multiple generations of increasingly elaborate ceremonial requirements. Sheriff Clayton Morse's arrival at Creekwalker's Lodge during Abigail's consultation created complications as the lawman's investigation into recent drownings and disappearances had revealed patterns that suggested deliberate rather than accidental deaths, challenging official explanations that attributed mysterious fatalities to natural hazards or individual misfortune rather than systematic predation by entities whose existence required acknowledgement of supernatural explanations that exceeded conventional law enforcement parameters and legal frameworks designed for addressing purely human criminal activity. The cavern's interior revealed the full scope of supernatural infrastructure that had been developed to support the Harlan family's obligations. As carved symbols covered limestone walls with records of individual sacrifices, while preserved skeletal remains provided physical evidence of systematic murder conducted according to spiritual requirements that demanded specific victim characteristics and ceremonial procedures designed to maximize spiritual nourishment extracted from human death and suffering. The archaeological evidence demonstrated that the family curse had affected dozens of generations, while enabling the Harlan bloodline to prosper through methods that required regular elimination of community members whose deaths maintained supernatural favor. The revelation that Abigail's unique spiritual sensitivity made her both essential to the family's supernatural obligations and potentially capable of breaking ancient agreements created understanding that her inherited abilities provided access to spiritual realms where counter-rituals might be performed if she possessed sufficient knowledge and determination to challenge entities whose power exceeded normal human comprehension, while accepting personal risks that could result in destruction of her entire bloodline through supernatural retaliation against those who violated sacred agreements. Creekwalker's demonstration of protective wards and spiritual techniques that had enabled him to resist supernatural influence throughout his adult life provided evidence that ancient entities could be challenged through proper application of traditional knowledge combined with personal spiritual strength that enabled individuals to maintain human identity while interacting with forces that systematically corrupted ordinary humans through psychological manipulation and gradual transformation into servants whose modified consciousness prioritized supernatural obligations over human moral frameworks. The warning that Creekwalker delivered regarding spring flood season's spiritual significance revealed that approaching environmental conditions would create unprecedented opportunity for supernatural entities to manifest with maximum power while enforcing ancient agreements through methods that could affect entire regional populations rather than limiting retaliation to specific bloodlines that challenged their authority. The seasonal alignment of natural and supernatural forces required immediate action to prevent potential massacre that might eliminate not only resistant families, but any community members whose knowledge or interference threatened supernatural secrecy. The spiritual preparation that Creekwalker provided for Abigail's potential confrontation with family curse included instruction in traditional protective techniques, consecration of ritual implements that might prove effective against supernatural entities, and psychological conditioning that could enable her to maintain human consciousness while interacting with forces that systematically corrupted ordinary individuals through gradual modification of moral frameworks and behavioral priorities that transformed human empathy into predatory instincts serving supernatural objectives. The revelation that previous attempts to break the Harlan curse had failed due to incomplete understanding of spiritual laws governing supernatural contracts created recognition that successful termination of ancient agreements required comprehensive knowledge of both original bargaining terms and counter-ritual procedures that could satisfy spiritual requirements for contract modification while providing alternative arrangements that might enable bloodline survival without continuing obligations to conduct systematic murder for supernatural entities whose protection had sustained family prosperity throughout generations of regional hardship. As floodwaters continued rising and supernatural activity intensified throughout the White River system, Abigail faced the terrifying recognition that her inherited abilities made her responsible for determining whether ancient agreements would continue binding future generations to service of entities whose demands were escalating beyond sustainable levels, requiring her to choose between accepting family obligations that demanded systematic murder or attempting to break supernatural contracts through methods that could result in destruction of everyone she loved while potentially failing to achieve freedom from inherited spiritual bondage. The spring floods of March 1883 transformed the White River into a torrent that carried more than melted snow and upstream debris. As supernatural forces that had been accumulating power throughout the winter months seized upon optimal environmental conditions to manifest with unprecedented intensity while enforcing ancient agreements through methods that exceeded previous scales of spiritual intervention in human affairs. The swollen waterways provided perfect concealment for aquatic entities whose territorial claims encompassed hundreds of miles of river system, while enabling transformed family members to operate with maximum effectiveness during seasonal periods when their enhanced capabilities could be deployed without risking discovery by ordinary humans. Magnus Harlan's emergence as the primary manifestation of family curse represented the culmination of decades of gradual transformation that had preserved his human intelligence while providing aquatic adaptations that enabled him to serve as commander of supernatural forces operating throughout the expanded river system. His physical modifications exceeded those of other family members through systematic enhancement that combined natural amphibious capabilities with supernatural strength and sensory abilities that qualified him for leadership roles requiring coordination of complex operations involving multiple transformed individuals and direct communication with ancient entities whose commands required precise implementation. The systematic coordination that characterized transformed family members' activities during flood season revealed sophisticated organizational capabilities that enabled them to conduct simultaneous attacks against multiple targets while maintaining operational security through methods that prevented survivors from recognizing supernatural rather than natural causation for systematic elimination of individuals whose presence or knowledge threatened spiritual secrecy. The tactical intelligence displayed by aquatic family members indicated that their transformation preserved and enhanced human cognitive abilities while modifying moral frameworks and behavioral priorities according to supernatural requirements. Rebecca Harlan's desperate attempt to protect her remaining children through direct confrontation with transformed relatives demonstrated maternal courage that exceeded normal human protective instincts, while revealing the inadequacy of conventional defensive measures against supernatural threats that operated beyond physical parameters. Her systematic preparation included acquisition of blessed weapons from Creek Walker's collection, coordination with local religious authorities whose prayers might provide spiritual protection, and development of escape routes that could enable non-transformed family members to reach sanctified locations where ancient entities' influence might be reduced through concentrated holy presence. The revelation that transformed family members retained detailed knowledge of their victims' personal lives, daily routines, and psychological vulnerabilities enabled them to conduct systematic stalking operations that maximized terror while ensuring successful elimination of target individuals through methods that exploited specific fears and behavioral patterns. The preservation of human intelligence within aquatic forms created predatory capabilities that exceeded simple animal hunting through application of sophisticated psychological manipulation and tactical planning that anticipated victim responses while preparing countermeasures for potential resistance or escape attempts. The underwater caverns that served as operational bases for transformed family members had been modified through supernatural engineering to accommodate large-scale activities during flood seasons, when increased water levels provided access to previously inaccessible limestone chambers where ritual implements and preserved remains could be stored while maintaining environmental conditions suitable for amphibious existence. The architectural modifications demonstrated long-term planning that anticipated seasonal requirements while providing infrastructure necessary for conducting elaborate ceremonial procedures that enhanced spiritual nourishment extracted from sacrificial victims. The systematic targeting of specific community members during flood season operations revealed that supernatural entities possess detailed knowledge of regional populations while maintaining preferences for victims whose elimination would provide maximum spiritual benefit through psychological trauma inflicted upon surviving family members and community destruction that enhanced fear levels throughout affected areas. The selection criteria included individuals whose knowledge or influence might threaten supernatural secrecy, alongside those whose deaths would create optimal conditions for harvesting spiritual energy from widespread community grief and terror. Rebecca's heroic sacrifice during the climactic confrontation with transformed family members demonstrated that human love could transcend supernatural manipulation, while providing temporary protection for innocent individuals whose survival depended upon someone accepting ultimate personal cost for their safety. Her deliberate choice to position herself between aquatic predators and her children created opportunities for escape while simultaneously fulfilling spiritual requirements that demanded blood payment for continued family survival according to ancient agreements that bound multiple generations to service of entities whose protection required regular demonstration of human devotion through ultimate sacrifice. The witnessing of maternal sacrifice created profound psychological trauma for Abigail that exceeded normal grief through recognition that her family's supernatural obligations would continue demanding similar payments throughout future generations unless fundamental changes could be achieved through methods that challenged ancient entities' authority over human lives and community welfare. The emotional impact of losing her mother, while understanding that additional sacrifices would be required, created determination that transcended personal survival instincts to encompass comprehensive resistance against spiritual systems that demanded systematic elimination of innocent individuals for supernatural purposes. The flood's peak intensity coincided with maximum supernatural manifestation as ancient entities achieved direct presence within physical realm through methods that exceeded normal spiritual influence to encompass tangible intervention in human affairs through environmental manipulation and creature control that demonstrated power levels sufficient for comprehensive regional domination, if human. Resistance continued threatening their territorial claims and operational secrecy. The demonstration of supernatural capabilities included weather control, animal behavior modification, and direct communication with human subjects whose compliance could be enforced through methods that exceeded psychological manipulation to encompass physical transformation according to predetermined specifications. The revelation that multiple generations of community members had been systematically eliminated to maintain supernatural agreements created understanding that the Harlan family curse affected entire regional populations rather than limiting consequences to specific bloodlines. as prosperity and protection provided through ancient pacts required regular harvesting of human life from broader community populations whose systematic reduction over decades had created optimal conditions for spiritual entities to maintain territorial control, while eliminating potential threats to their continued dominance over human affairs. The psychological conditioning that enabled transformed family members to conduct systematic murder while retaining human consciousness revealed the comprehensive nature of spiritual corruption that accompanied aquatic adaptation. As supernatural modification included behavioral programming that eliminated empathy and moral restraints while preserving intellectual capabilities necessary for effective predatory operations. The retention of human intelligence within predatory frameworks created horror that exceeded simple monster attacks through deliberate application of psychological torture and systematic exploitation of victim fears and emotional vulnerabilities. The coordination between multiple supernatural entities during flood season operations demonstrated that ancient agreements involved complex spiritual hierarchies whose territorial claims extended throughout river systems, connecting multiple states and affecting numerous human communities whose prosperity and survival depended upon maintaining favor with aquatic entities whose protection required regular payment in human blood and systematic elimination of individuals whose knowledge or resistance threatened supernatural secrecy and operational effectiveness. The environmental manipulation that accompanied supernatural manifestation included acceleration of natural flood cycles, modification of weather patterns to create optimal conditions for aquatic operations, and influence over wildlife behavior that enabled transformed family members to coordinate with natural predators while conducting systematic elimination of target individuals through methods that appeared consistent with environmental hazards rather than deliberate supernatural predation, requiring human agency and spiritual motivation. As floodwaters reached record levels and supernatural activity intensified beyond previous seasonal patterns, Abigail recognized that her role as last untransformed family member made her both primary target for spiritual entities seeking to complete bloodline conversion and sole remaining individual capable of challenging ancient agreements through methods that required comprehensive understanding of spiritual laws governing supernatural contracts while accepting personal risks that could result in destruction of everyone she sought to protect through resistance to inherited obligations that demanded systematic murder for supernatural purposes. The approaching climax of supernatural activity during spring's peak flood conditions created urgent necessity for decisive action against ancient entities whose patience with human resistance was reaching predetermined limits, requiring Abigail to choose between accepting transformation that would preserve her life while enabling her to serve supernatural objectives through systematic elimination of community members or attempting to break family curse through counter-rituals that could destroy not only ancient agreements, but potentially everyone affected by decades of spiritual contamination and supernatural influence throughout the White River system. The convergence of spring flood conditions with supernatural forces at their annual peak created circumstances where ancient spiritual laws governing the Harlan family curse could be challenged through counter-rituals that required voluntary entry into realms where physical and spiritual realities intersected according to primordial agreements that predated human understanding of natural law. While binding bloodlines to service of entities whose territorial claims transcended normal temporal limitations and demanded acknowledgement through methods that exceeded mortal comprehension of justice and reciprocal obligation. Abigail's descent into the flooded bone cavern carried shamanic relics, consecrated by creek walkers' traditional knowledge, alongside personal spiritual strength that had been systematically developed through inherited sensitivity to supernatural phenomena, creating optimal conditions for confronting ancient entities whose power derived from centuries of accumulated human sacrifice, while their vulnerability remained tied to specific contractual terms that could be modified through proper application of spiritual countermeasures and deliberate violation of original agreement conditions. The underwater journey through limestone passages carved by supernatural forces during millennia of spiritual activity required Abigail to maintain consciousness while submersed in waters that carried psychic contamination from decades of ritual drowning and systematic sacrifice, creating environmental conditions where ordinary humans would experience psychological breakdown, while individuals possessing inherited spiritual sensitivity could access enhanced perceptual abilities that enabled communication with entities whose existence transcended normal physical parameters and required acknowledgement through traditional spiritual protocols. The ritual chamber, where original family agreements had been sealed, contained carved symbols that recorded specific terms of supernatural contracts alongside architectural modifications that enabled communication between human and aquatic realms, while providing infrastructure necessary for conducting counter-rituals that could satisfy ancient spiritual laws governing contract termination through methods that required ultimate sacrifice of accumulated prosperity and power in exchange for bloodline freedom from inherited obligations to conduct systematic murder for supernatural entities. The confrontation with river spirits in ethereal space between physical and spiritual realms revealed that ancient entities possessed legitimate territorial claims that preceded human settlement, while their protection of chosen bloodlines represented reciprocal arrangements that provided mutual benefit through methods that maintained ecological balance between human and supernatural populations. According to spiritual laws that governed interspecies relationships and territorial sharing throughout regions where multiple forms of consciousness competed for environmental resources and survival advantages. Magnus Harlan's final manifestation as fully transformed aquatic horror demonstrated the ultimate consequences of complete spiritual corruption, as his retention of human intelligence within monstrous form enabled him to serve as spokesman for supernatural entities, while simultaneously representing the fate that awaited all family members whose bloodline contained genetic programming that would eventually compel transformation, regardless of personal moral objections or resistance to inherited spiritual obligations that bound entire generations to service of ancient territorial guardians. The spiritual negotiation that preceded counter-ritual implementation required Abigail to acknowledge legitimate grievances of ancient entities whose territorial rights had been systematically violated by human expansion, while simultaneously challenging the necessity for continued systematic sacrifice of innocent individuals whose deaths provided spiritual nourishment that could be obtained through alternative methods that maintained ecological balance without requiring regular murder of community members whose elimination created widespread trauma and social disruption. The revelation that breaking supernatural contracts required comprehensive renunciation of all benefits derived from ancient agreements created understanding that terminating the family curse would eliminate not only obligations to conduct systematic murder, but also protection from natural disasters, abundance of fishing and hunting, and prosperity that had sustained the Harlan bloodline throughout generations of regional hardship that had destroyed less favored families through environmental challenges and economic difficulties that exceeded normal human survival capabilities. The counter-ritual procedure that Creekwalker's instruction had prepared involved systematic destruction of carved symbols that recorded original agreement terms while simultaneously offering alternative arrangements that could satisfy ancient entities' territorial requirements through methods that respected their legitimate claims while eliminating human obligations to conduct regular sacrifice. Of community members whose deaths had maintained supernatural favor throughout decades of systematic predation disguised as natural phenomena or accidental misfortune. The ethereal fire that consumed ancient symbols represented spiritual energy that had been accumulated through generations of shamanic practice and traditional knowledge, creating sufficient power to modify fundamental spiritual laws governing supernatural contracts while enabling Abigail to serve as intermediary between human and aquatic realms through methods that required ultimate personal sacrifice of individual survival in exchange for comprehensive protection of future generations from inherited spiritual bondage and systematic murder obligations. Magnus's desperate attempt to prevent contract termination revealed that fully transformed family members retained sufficient human consciousness to understand consequences of losing supernatural power and protection that had sustained their existence, while recognizing that reverting to purely human status during flood conditions would result in immediate death through inability to survive in aquatic environments that required specialized physiological adaptations for continued existence during seasonal periods of maximum environmental challenge. The successful completion of counter-ritual procedures created cascading spiritual effects that terminated not only supernatural contracts binding the Harlan bloodline, but also protective agreements that had shielded transformed family members from natural consequences of their aquatic adaptations, resulting in systematic reversion to human physiology that proved incompatible with underwater existence during flood conditions, when survival required specialized capabilities that ordinary human biology could not provide. The drowning of transformed family members during their reversion to human form represented tragic consequence of spiritual liberation, as termination of supernatural contracts eliminated both obligations to conduct systematic murder and biological modifications that had enabled amphibious existence, forcing individuals whose consciousness had been preserved throughout transformation to experience final moments of human awareness, while understanding that their sacrifice had purchased freedom for future generations from inherited spiritual bondage and systematic murder requirements. Abigail's emergence as sole survivor of family curse termination carried permanent physical modifications that served as visible reminder of supernatural heritage, while indicating that complete elimination of spiritual influence was impossible for individuals whose bloodline contained genetic programming that had been modified through generations of supernatural interaction. The scales that marked her skin provided protection and enhanced capabilities, while ensuring that knowledge of family history would be preserved through visible evidence of spiritual heritage that exceeded normal human biological parameters. The liberation from supernatural contracts created immediate environmental consequences as ancient entities withdrew protection from natural disasters and seasonal challenges that had previously been mitigated through spiritual intervention, requiring surviving community members to develop alternative methods for addressing environmental hardships that had been supernaturally ameliorated through systematic human sacrifice and territorial agreements that maintained ecological balance between human and supernatural populations throughout the White River system. The spiritual exhaustion that accompanied counter-ritual completion left Abigail permanently changed through exposure to spiritual forces that exceeded normal human psychological capacity, creating enhanced sensitivity to supernatural phenomena, while simultaneously eliminating genetic programming that would have eventually compelled transformation into aquatic form, according to inherited obligations that bound multiple generations to service of ancient territorial entities whose continued favor required regular demonstration of human devotion through ultimate sacrifice. The final recognition that breaking family curse had eliminated not only supernatural obligations, but also accumulated prosperity and community influence, created understanding that spiritual liberation required comprehensive renunciation of benefits that had been purchased through systematic murder, while accepting responsibility for addressing environmental and economic challenges without. Supernatural assistance that had sustained regional human populations throughout decades of territorial sharing with ancient entities whose protection had prevented natural disasters and ecological collapse. As floodwaters receded and normal seasonal patterns resumed without supernatural intervention, Abigail faced the complex responsibility of rebuilding human community relationships while maintaining knowledge of spiritual heritage that could provide protection against future supernatural threats without recreating conditions that might enable ancient entities to re-establish territorial claims and human bloodline obligations through alternative contractual arrangements that could bind future generations to similar patterns of systematic sacrifice and spiritual servitude in exchange for temporary prosperity and environmental protection.